begin by introducing my sister-in-law who joined me tonight, Judy Various. Judy, put up your hands, everybody. Yeah. That's my brother Gene's wife, and she wanted to come join us tonight for church, so I'm just glad she can be with us and you can be with her. So I'd like to take this gospel of Jesus being tempted in the desert and play with it and look at it in a little different way than perhaps you've thought of it before. And I'm hoping by doing that I'll be able to say something speaking to our present time and some of the issues that we're facing here in our own country. So you probably know, if you've been listening to sermons for a long time, or if you know on your own, otherwise your own study, that when Jesus is being confronted by the devil, this is a literary composition that is positing the forces of evil, the cosmic forces of evil, and personifies them into this figure that is referred to as the devil. It's not meant to be someone that can be seen. It's not even really meant to be someone. But it's a convention that allows the storyteller to explain how Jesus was wrestling with a temptation. And as I thought about this, it occurred to me that there's something about seeing the devil as someone outside ourselves that really makes it difficult to understand what the main point of the story is. The main point of the story is that Jesus was tempted. Passive voice, was tempted. It's not important who tempted him. The important thing is what's going on inside of Jesus. There are stories in the Old Testament about God putting people to the test. And that's led to all kinds of problems where people are scratching their head going, well, what kind of God would tease with us in that way? Oh, I'll give you this pestilence or something and see how you deal with it. It makes God out to be a kind of a bad babysitter, like really sick person who ought to be turned into the police. So I can't say this strongly enough. It's so important that we just simply say that Jesus was tempted, because that's the important thing. And why is someone tempted? What does it even mean to be tempted, to do something that you feel that you shouldn't be doing? It's because if you understand who you are, and you understand what comes from that, there's a tension when you're in certain situations where you feel like you're tempted to go outside of the person you know you ought to be. All right? But it's an internal struggle that's going on. I'm tempted not to be my true self in this situation. That's what it really means. And when monks have a spiritual director, or when Jesus had disciples, whenever someone's teaching spirituality to another person, whether that's Christianity or within Buddhism, the teacher is simply wanting the person who's the disciple to identify when they're being tempted not to follow their true self. It's not about pleasing the teacher. It's not like God puts this on us. Wars happen. Cancer happens. Bad things happen. Your friends decide to go off on you in the middle of dinner. It just happens. It doesn't do any good to pretend that there's some figure out here that I can blame. If I just know that the devil's the one who did it, then the devil can leave, and I'm like, whew, that's over. But there's never a time when it's over. There's never a time when we stop being tempted to not be our true selves. And teachers of spirituality understand this, and we should understand this as we grow in the spiritual life. So Jesus understood that the way he put it in the Gospels, pictured in the Gospel of saying that he was the Son of God, that God called him his son. This was a term that was also given to the kings of Israel. So at the least, he understood that he was an important agent of God. That he was an important agent of God. Son is a good word. Son is a good word because it has this personal sense of being a personal agent of the one who has the ultimate authority. And this stamped Jesus' identity. And he was completely locked into this sense of who he was. And so for him to be tempted to these things that the devil puts before him, it didn't mean that those things weren't things he was going to get anyway. The devil promises to put him over, the whole world. Well, Matthew goes on to explain that ultimately Jesus has authority over the whole world. So it's not like the devil is tempting him with things he can't get somewhere else. The important thing is that he had to stay true to the one who sent him, that was his identity. And to do otherwise would be stepping out of who he was. I think this is important today in 2026 because many of us are completely reviled by the way we see immigration enforcement happening in the United States. We find it repulsive. There's something inside that makes us so angry, we want to scream at somebody. That how could this be happening in this way? Yes, countries have the ability and should, in fact, the responsibility to manage migration within their own country. Yeah, sure. And they have a responsibility to take care of the common good. Yeah, sure. But they don't have the authority to handle it the way it appears to be handled right now. With violence, with oppression, with disregard for rights, with acting as if people have no dignity. This is wrong. But notice, if I were to name the person whose policies I think this is, and I were to rail at that person as if you're evil, and I would just go on and on like that, okay. And I'm not saying leaders should not be called out. Jesus was not adverse to calling out the leaders of his time. The prophets before him called out the leaders of their time and said when the leaders were doing things that were unjust. So I'm not going down that road. But what I am saying is if you compare the difference between me hollering at a leader and sort of getting out all this anger that way and what we really should be doing, it's a big, big difference. And what we should be doing is noticing that in a situation like this, it's time to stand up. It's time to live out who we are, not to forget who we are. The temptation in us is to put the blame somewhere else and sort of be done with it that way. It's not helping just to be mad at somebody. Like I said, there's a place for that. But that's not what this gospel is telling us tonight. The gospel is telling us that we need to look at how we're tempted not to be who we're called to be. How we're called to be in this situation could not have been expressed this week better than what the Roman Catholic bishops, I have to pay due to the Roman Catholic bishops of the United States, of Canada, of Latin America, and of the Caribbean. They decided to get together and act as one church. And they wrote a really important pastoral letter. It's not long. You might want to check it out if what I'm about to say is of any interest to you. It's at the U.S. Catholic Bishops' website. And in the midst of the situation of immigration, they have a number of things that they want to say. The first is, this is one church. We're not a bunch of little churches in our little countries, all fragmented. We're not. We're one church of the Americas. And this church happens to be on a pilgrimage. They chose that word because they're talking about immigration. They said, on a pilgrimage throughout the Americas. So that's the first thing. They want us to see ourselves as one. And then they say, let's talk about the immigrant. The immigrant is never a stranger to the church, because Jesus taught us about how to look at a stranger. And so we never look at a stranger without seeing the face of Christ. And then they say, when we see immigrants, we see the face of Christ on the move. The face of Christ on the move. That's how they define an immigrant. Then they say that they want to coordinate all the various congregations of all the churches throughout North and South America and the Caribbean, and coordinate their efforts together so that in every place, from the start of an immigrant's journey to the transit through that person's journey to the place where they land, that they will always see the church the same way, as a sign of hope, a place of welcome, and a place of protection. This is an amazing vision. And it says, as I alluded to before, they make explicit that, yes, states have rights when it comes to migration, but states can't pretend to speak at the higher level of what migration is. Think about it. Think about looking at the Earth, the blue dot from the space station, and ask yourself, is it one or is it a bunch of little things? All right, always from the big picture, it's always one thing. And migration is something that has been happening within the human race since its beginning. The human race started in one place and migrated throughout the world. And peoples have been migrating for every century that we have had human history. And they have always had to flee places where they were unsafe, or they fled places where they were not getting enough food. Some of our ancestors came to the United States because of famine in their own countries. Migration has been going on forever and always. And so if we're taking the big picture, you see the process of humanity fighting for its own existence, its own safety, its own nurturance, its own opportunity, its own need for a sense of dignity from oppressive regimes. And so this is the vision that they're seeing, and they want the church to be that sign of hope wherever the migrant stops along his or her way. At the end, they say, we call for a generous welcome of migrants, the defense of the most vulnerable, respectful dialogue, even amidst differences, and the patient building of bridges. May our parishes, communities, and families be visible signs that fraternity is possible. This is something that's supposed to come down to the personal level, so I want to end on a story I heard about a teacher. It was an interview of a teacher up in Minneapolis who was being asked about what it was like for her to have her students missing the classroom. And she explained that it was ripping her up and all of her fellow teachers. And she said, we're not just teachers. We aren't just people, trying to teach them things like get your math right, but we care for these children. And so we wonder how they are, and they tell us they're afraid, and that's something that enters into us. They see them as human beings. They remember who they are when they look at an immigrant. And this one teacher said, I went to where one of my students was in custody to visit them. I don't know if it was a boy or a girl. I went to visit them, and they said I said, "Would you do something for me?" And I said, "Sure, what?" "Would you go back to my home and see if my bike is still there?" Isn't that perfect? Just a little window into a child being a child. But isn't it a better window into that teacher being a compassionate person who immediately understood this was important to that child? So she went back to the home to find if the bicycle was there. And she was taking a risk going to that home, into that neighborhood, looking for a bike after people had been removed from the home. Maybe she was tempted. Maybe she was tempted to say, "Oh, I can't do that." But instead, she remembered who she was. And I thank God that the bishops of the Americas remembered who they were and stood up and made a statement. And it isn't just for this teacher in Minneapolis or for the bishops, it's for each one of us. So let's encourage one another during this time where we might be tempted to simply rail against the authorities that be. There's a place for that. But also to add to it, and maybe more importantly for our own souls, to encourage one another to remember who we are and do things that act out of that.